Well, welcome to another Friday night. We've been doing a series once a month on understanding trauma. And I think in order to really understand trauma, it's really important to understand the major responses that people have when they're in danger. And so over the years, there's been what has become known as the 4 Fs. And the 4 Fs are fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And they become quite well known. And what I want to do today is really dig into that and help you understand the 4 Fs, but help you kind of think about it at deeper levels. Because to me, for many people, there's layers of understanding the 4 Fs that just add a whole bunch of insight into understanding ourselves. And it's important to understand the 4 Fs in light of complex trauma. And so what happens for many people in complex trauma is that they will start with one of the Fs, it doesn't work. They go to another F, it doesn't work. They go to another F, it doesn't work. And so they try all of the Fs, and then they find that sometimes they end up with a blend of the 4 Fs that seem to work, or they end up with, they use one of the Fs on when they're in danger with one person, and they use a different F when they're in danger with another person. And so they kind of draw on a variety of different responses based on what they've had to do to survive. And so we're going to really dig into understand the 4 Fs, and kind of what's going to come out of that is 14 variations or blends or nuances of the 4 Fs that I hope will really help you understand yourself, understand your style of how you respond when you feel danger. So let me just begin with just describing the 4 Fs and a little bit about them to help you understand. So the first is fight. And fight is when I have somebody attacking me who's going to hurt me. Fight is I'm going to become stronger than them and defeat them. I will beat them. I will attack them physically in order to subdue them. And so that's how I will resolve this danger. And so to do that, most people resort to anger, and it's fueled by cortisol and adrenaline, which gives you the extra energy you need to fight. And so some go to a rage that becomes part of just what fuels this energy. It's a very aggressive type of attack. The other that some develop is a passive aggressive, almost a guerrilla warfare type of thing, where they use more words, they use more sneaky things to defeat the enemy. But it's still fight. It's still an attack to defeat the enemy. And so another way to look at this is what you're doing with fight is you're tackling your external world where the problem is and subduing it. So it's focused on the external world. Now, one of the nuances that has come out in connection with fight is flood. And what it means is when a person is triggered in a situation, they get flooded by emotions, and then they dysregulate. They can't regulate those emotions because they're so intense. So they dysregulate, and as a result of that dysregulation is they lash out, they express these very intense emotions intensely. And so it's a very emotional driven fight type of thing. So that's fight. Then the second is some people realize they can't defeat the enemy, they can't fight, so they go to the second one, which is flight. And that is run away from the threat. So this is fueled by cortisol and adrenaline again, which gives you extra energy or speed to run faster, to get away from the threat. So it's all about you can't defeat the enemy, so avoid the enemy. Get away from the threat. That's how you resolve it. That's how you fix it. So again, you are dealing with your external environment and trying to find a safe place within that external environment. So that can then go into other ways of describing that. So flight is basically avoid, and some people take that to stick your head in the sand. There's problems. Nope, don't admit them, deny that they're even there, don't talk about it. Other people avoid by, let's just stay busy and distracted. That way we don't have to think about it. That way we don't have to feel those feelings. So let's just busy, 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 busy. And that's our way of avoiding the threat. So as you can see with the flight, there's an element of anxiety and panic that's going to be part of the emotional world there. So fight and flight, both of those fueled by adrenaline, cortisol, both of them trying to find safety by dealing with the external world. So that leads us to the third one, which is freeze. So this then becomes significant in complex trauma because it's the situation where a person is too little to fight, too little to flight. They can't flee, they can't run away from home, or they're in an abusive relationship, they can't fight, they don't feel they can run away. So what then do they do to try to keep safe? They freeze. And so this is where the body realizes I can't fix the external world, so I will retreat to an internal world. So now, instead of using cortisol and adrenaline to fight flight, it goes to using opioids to prepare the body to get hurt. Basically, what it's saying is, I can't fight or flight, so I will get hurt. So the opioids, they bring all the blood around the heart, away from the extremities, so that if I get cut, I'm not going to bleed as much. It brings everything into just the basic organs that need blood to survive. Everything else is expendable. And so it prepares to get hurt. But what then happens for many people with that is they dissociate. Their solution is not now in fixing the external world. Their solution is retreating to an internal world where they feel safe. And so opioids provide the numbing, and they provide the ability to pull inward and dissociate. And so that becomes an important way of surviving for many people, children especially in complex trauma, is they freeze. So it can go a bit further, and that is where people get to the point where if they feel in danger, they don't want to feel the fear emotions, they don't want to feel the hurt, so they go to a numbing. So numbing is a form of freezing. And so some people numb by drugs and alcohol. Let's use chemicals so we don't feel emotions. Other people numb by, let's stay busy and have constant activities. Some numb by just let's shut down our emotions. Let's disconnect from our emotions. Let's harden our heart. Let's just not feel anything. Others numb by hardening their conscience. So I don't want to have a conscience because that makes me weak and liable to pain. And so all of those become ways of freezing. Now, again, there's some nuances in connection with the freeze. So some of you may have heard of faint or collapse. And so that's the person who basically just goes, they faint actually, or they just go catatonic. They just stand there frozen, where they just stare blankly. And so what the body has released is not just opioids, but what we call dynorphins. And dynorphins, they allow a person to become catatonic, but for some, it takes them to an out-of-body experience. So they can be being sexually abused, but it's like they're not in their own body. They're somewhere else, or they're on the ceiling watching it as if it's happening to somebody else. And so what's happening is the parasympathetic is basically overpowering and shutting down the sympathetic nervous system, because it's saying the sympathetic can't fight or flight. So I have to take over and totally shut this person down. So they collapse. The second one is what some call flop. And what that basically means is the person who just gives up. It's all my fault. It's not worth it. I can't do it. This is so overwhelming. I'm so disheartened. I'm so discouraged. I can't escape. So just give in, give up, flop. So that's another type of freeze response. The third nuanced freeze response is what they call fatigue. And that is the person who goes, I can't deal with life. Let's just sleep all the time. And so they're just constantly, they feel tired. Every time there's extra stress, every time they perceive any threat, they just get, I want to go to bed. I just want to sleep my day away. So that's another freeze type response. And then the fourth one is called friend. And what that means is I can't help myself, or they feel helpless to help themselves. They feel like a total victim. So they just call for a friend, wanting the friend to fix everything, to rescue them, to do whatever needs to be done, but they're paralyzed to do anything for themselves. So that's the friend response. So then we go to number 4 of the 4 main ones, the fawn response. So this again is a progression. So the person can't fight or flight, so they go to freeze. But then they find with the freeze, they still get hurt. And that's, the brain doesn't want that. And so the brain goes to a 4th survival, kind of an extreme survival, which is called the fawn response. And so what the conclusion of the brain is that the best chance of survival, the best way to not get hurt, is I must get on the good side of the person in power who is hurting me. I must please them. I must get them to like me. And so it becomes a very much a people-pleasing thing. But in order to do that, I must know the person in power very well. I must understand their emotions. I must be attuned to their emotions so that I can prevent them from having outbursts. So I need to take responsibility for their moods, their emotions, their feelings. All of that becomes part of this fawn response. And so what you can see is that really it's the beginnings of codependency. So it's a child going, for me to stay safe, I need to take care of the other person's emotions. I need to know how they think, how they feel. I need to be more attuned to them. So there's 3 types of kind of nuances of the fawn response. So the one that is the most known and talked about is the please, appease. And it's kind of what I just described. It's the child who is, I must be wholly aware of the person in power's thoughts, feelings. I must understand them better than myself. So there's a double consciousness that exists in this child or this person. They're aware of themselves a little bit, but they're more aware of the person in power, how they're thinking, how they're feeling, what they want, what their needs are. And in themselves, they're slightly aware of stuff, but they have to put their needs down. They have to submerge their needs, suppress their needs, because their needs don't matter right now. They have to be aware of the other person's needs and respond to them if they're going to survive. And so it's really an attempt to almost shrink myself, erase my needs, erase my emotions, and become almost a clone of the other person, fully aware of the other person, so that I can respond to the other person before they blow up, before they become dysregulated. So if I sense that their opinion is very strong in this area, I'm going to agree with it. If I sense they're getting angry, I'm going to do stuff to calm them down before they erupt. So I'm going to be very attuned to them. I'm going to give up all my needs, all my rights, and give them whatever they want in order to keep them happy. That is what this please and appease is all about. So what you can see is this type of fawner, they act so friendly, they act so warm, they act, yes sir, so agreeable. But it's really the sympathetic nervous system masquerading like it's connecting, but it's not really connecting. They appear to be so connected to the other person, but what they are doing is they're a pseudo connection in order to stop the other person from erupting in order to protect themselves. So I'm going to prevent you from going into fight so that I don't get hurt. So that is what this please and appease is all about. So some of the indicators of this is a person who is just very, when they meet you and get to know you, they're just effusive with praise. They just overdo telling you how wonderful you are and all they like about you. But then you notice they watch you like a hawk. They're studying you. They're getting to know how you think, your priorities, your values, your emotional, how you respond. And then they ask you very personal questions all the time, wanting to know details that often just feel not appropriate. They're just a wee bit too much. And then they look for opportunities to do things for you, to try to please you. Then they'll kind of wait around for your approval. And then you'll notice that they'll not share some things with you, but they'll overshare other things. And the things they don't share are things they're afraid you wouldn't like if you knew about them. So those are some of the indicators of the please appease type people. Then the second nuance of the fawn is what we call the attach cry for help. And this is, if you think of kind of a baby that is in great, great danger, what is their only recourse is they have to run to mom, but they attach, they latch on, they cry, they scream. They're just wholly dysregulated because they're in a state of desperation and panic. And so their person is crying for more than just support. What they're basically saying is, I can't survive unless you take care of me. And so sometimes adults can revert to that kind of desperation when they're in certain situations. And so they do this attach cry for help with their friends. So they see their friends as their savior. And so they attach in ways that are very intense and often are very intrusive. So maybe you can relate to having a friend like that. But some of the indicators would be a person who all of a sudden they just multiple text, email, text, desperate. And then if you meet with them, then they complain that you didn't give them enough time. You say you only had an hour, but they want 2 hours. And then they want to kind of set up another time to meet you, maybe later in the day or the next day. So you just see this desperation to dominate your time, to have all of your time. And they might even show up at your house. You didn't invite them, they didn't ask to come, they just show up and want you to take them in and let them talk. And then if you refuse, then they lash out at you and they call you uncaring and all kinds of things. And so they become this very childlike person who cannot regulate at all. So then the third nuance of the fawn is what is known as the collapse submit. So we've already talked about the person who faints or flops. So they go catatonic, they just shut down, their muscles go limp. Sometimes they go to an out-of-body experience. But this person, it goes further. So what happens is once they shut down, they then become robotic. So they just go catatonic, but then they become super compliant. So let me give you an example. So let's say a child was raped by their father, sexually abused by their father for years and years of their childhood. They couldn't do anything to prevent it. So what did they do? They just went to catatonic. They allowed it to happen because that was their only way of survival. And they tried to just blank out and be a compliant child. But now they're 40 years old. Now their dad shows up at their door. They know their dad has come to have sex with them. What do? They go catatonic. They let their dad in the house. They just kind of go into this robotic state where their dad is able to do whatever he wants. So they still feel helpless. They still feel they can do nothing to stop it, to stand up for themselves. They're stuck as a victim. And so they just collapse and then submit. And so that is kind of that fawning place where they're not trying necessarily to be super sweet and super nice. They just go to robotic and submit. So that's the fawn response. So those are the four main F's. So now what I want to do is come at it from a different angle and start taking you to different perspectives that'll hopefully fill out your understanding of the four F's. What I want you to realize, first of all, is that the four F's originally start as healthy responses to danger. It's complex trauma that causes them to become unhealthy responses to danger. So just look at healthy fawning. What does that mean? So it really has kind of two ways that healthy fawning can work out. So this, number one, would be the non-groveling. You got somebody who's angry, who's upset with you, they're kind of lashing out, but you listen to them, you discuss stuff with them, you try to find common ground where you can agree, you try to bring about kind of we negotiate our differences, you try to calm them down, reach a compromise. And in doing so, you're expressing your needs, your opinions, you're being assertive, but you're being accommodating as possible. You're trying to work it out. You're not going to fight. You're not going to lashing out. It looks like fawning, but it's healthy response to a person who's very upset. So that's an original healthy type of fawning response. The second one is what is known as tend and befriend. And so what happens when we're in danger? Oxytocin is released in our brains, and oxytocin has a double effect. So number one, it says, I will protect my child. I will tend to their needs to protect them from this danger. But then in the child is, I will run to those who can support me. I can't handle this danger alone. I need to reach out for help. So I will run to those I know who are safe and love me. And so that's healthy fawning. So then there's healthy fight. So what healthy fight is really is standing up to bullies to protect yourself. And so healthy fight is, I'm going to set good boundaries. I'm going to be assertive. I'm going to stand up for myself. What happens when that no longer works? Then you go to unhealthy fight, which I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to defeat you. I am going to dominate you. I am going to decimate you. So that's where healthy fight switches into unhealthy because standing up to the bullies, setting good boundaries was no longer working. I had to go to dominating the bully. Then there's healthy flight. So it's realizing sometimes that when you're in conflict with an angry person, this isn't going to get resolved. So there's no point having this conflict right now. So I am going to go away from this conflict. That is healthy flight. Or healthy flight is you're in a dangerous place, you see a fight break out, and you go, you know what, I need to get out of here. And I need to move to a safe place because this is dangerous right now. Or a conflict's about to happen, but you realize if I join in this conflict, it's only going to make it worse. It's not going to resolve anything because this isn't the right time. Everybody's too worked up. So I'm going to retreat until everybody's cooled down. So that's healthy. That flight, it's not to permanently stay in a flight position to permanently avoid. It's a temporary thing because now is not the right time. What is unhealthy flight then? Unhealthy flight is I'm going to stay away. I'm going to avoid, and never confront because I don't think confrontation will ever resolve anything. And so that's what happens with complex trauma is you get to the point where you go, confrontation is always bad. Conflict always is bad. Somebody always wins. Somebody always loses. It never gets resolved well. So just avoid, and it becomes unhealthy flight. Then there is healthy freeze. So you think of an animal where they hear a loud noise, they freeze, they may drop to the ground. Well, what are they doing? They're pausing to assess what to do next. Where do I find safety? What's the next best move right now? That's important. So it's again a temporary thing. Or there's another type of healthy freeze, and that's somebody who is trying to confront a situation. So you're wrestling a bully, and then all of a sudden you realize, I'm losing. There's no point. Keep on fighting and making things worse. Just give up right now and just freeze. And then we can come back and figure out how to solve this later. Unhealthy freeze is, you know what? There's never going to be a solution. So don't even try. So your pause, temporary freeze turns into permanent. As soon as there's danger, as soon as there's any sign of trouble, shut down, dissociate, because there's no solution, retreat into your internal world. Whereas healthy freeze is retreat into your internal world temporarily so you can go back out into your external world. So let me take it to another perspective that I think is important to understand. Think of a child in a healthy home. So they face danger. What do? Well, they respond with the 4 F's, but they respond with the 4 healthy forms of F. Healthy fight, healthy flight, healthy freeze, healthy fawn. All of them temporary to figure out what to do to resolve the problem. All of them working to resolve the problem in healthy ways. And so the child in a healthy home, what they're also learning is to be flexible, that some situations you'll use healthy fight. You'll stand up, you'll be assertive, you'll set boundaries. Others, you're going to freeze temporarily to assess what to do. Others, you're going to do kind of a healthy fawn. You're going to enter into a dialogue. You're going to try to work out a solution. All of those become part of their toolkit. They learn to adapt in a situation as to which of the F's is going to work best. And so a child in a healthy home ends up with a flexible response repertoire when it comes to the 4 F's. It's complex trauma that changes that, because the child tries the 4Fs in healthy ways. None of them work. None of them resolve the problem. And so what do they have to do? Well, they got to go to the survival mode for unhealthy Fs. It switches for them. And so what then begins to happen is the child might try fight. That didn't work. They got beat up by dad. They might try flight. Well, they can't run away from home. They try freeze. They try fawn. They try the different nuances of all of those. And then they begin to find one or two that works best for them. And that becomes kind of their style. And so at the first sight of danger, they just go to that style. They're not flexible and adaptable. They just go to what has become their style. Or the other option for some is they realize that they have some flexibility, not great flexibility, but if they meet somebody weaker, they go to fight because I can beat you. If they meet somebody stronger, they go to flight because I got to run away from you. So they switch depending on the situation, but it's always to an unhealthy form. And so that is what begins to happen for a complex trauma child. So they get more limited in their responses, and often they kind of get stuck in responding a certain way most of the time. Now, Pete Walker, in his book Complex PTSD, has done some really good work in these 4Fs, and what he's come up with are trauma hybrids. And I find that they're helpful. I think they're important to think through, but let me just give you the hybrids that are presented by Pete Walker, and you can dig into it on your own. But the first hybrid that he presents is the fight fawn response, a blend between fight and fawn, and he calls it the charming bully. And I think it's a really significant one to understand. So if you look at a narcissist, the bully, often they're very charming in the beginning. They groom the other person. They're super sweet. Everybody thinks they're so loving. They're so charming. And that's often for the first 3-6 months, even a year, where they're just this wonderful, wonderful person. Then all of a sudden they switch and they become this bully. The second hybrid is the fawn fight. So they fawn, but then there's a fight there as well. And so he calls this the smother mother. So the one that just smothers you with kindness. So they're super aggressive and being sweet and kind to you. And that's the fawning part. But the goal of that is to control you. That's the fight part. And so they so sweet, so kind that they start to violate your boundaries. They start to make decisions for you. They're taking away your freedom. And so it's fawning and appearing sweet, but it's actually a fight mechanism where they're wanting to control you. And so it's kindness, smothering kindness with strings attached. It's grooming you, being kind to you, but with a hidden agenda, so they can get you to do what they want. And so it's a kindness that is actually manipulative and coercive. So that's the fawn fight. And then there's the fawn flight. And Pete Walker refers to this as the super nurse. And so this is the person who works tirelessly to help others. That's the fawn. They're always caring for others, helping others, but they don't take care of themselves. There's a flight there. They're avoiding their own personal life. And so this is the person who isn't comfortable living within their own emotional world, their unpleasant emotions, their painful emotions. And so they need to distract themselves from themselves. So they need a flight from themselves. So they take care of others. That's their distraction. They fawn over others. And so they're always trying to fix everybody else, but they're not ever working on themselves. Now, for many people like this, they develop the own internal narrative that they're just a very selfless caregiver. They refuse to see that they're actually avoiding their own pain. Then there's the fawn freeze. So there's a fawning, but there's a freeze. So this is the person you think of in severely abusive relationships often, who they just let people walk all over them. They let people abuse them. And they just accept the odd crumb of love. So it's like a beaten puppy that just hangs around. They refuse to run away. They freeze. They refuse to help themselves. They refuse to say, I'm not going to take this anymore and stand up for themselves. They keep trying to please the other person to get the other person to like them, but they continue to get beaten, abused, etc. And so they're fawning, trying to get love. They're just getting the odd crumb. They're getting all kinds of abuse, but they won't do anything about it. And so it's a learned helplessness. They hate they're being abused. They complain about it to their friends, but they don't do anything to change it, to leave the situation. So a fawn freeze hybrid. Then there's the fight freeze hybrid. This is the angry person who's always fighting, lashing out, mad at the world, hurting those closest to them. They know they have a problem. They know they need to get help, but this is where they freeze. They refuse to do anything to get help for themselves. And so this is the person who ends up in a program where they're getting help, not because they chose to go there, but because the courts forced them to go there, or their partner gave them an ultimatum, you go there or I'm out of here, or their partner dragged them there kicking and screaming. So they're hurting and fighting everybody else, but they freeze when it comes to getting help for themselves. And so this is usually a narcissist who demands that everything goes their way and is fighting everybody, but is unable to face themselves and their own shame and their own failures and their own flaws. That's where they freeze. Then the sixth hybrid is flight freeze. So this is the person who is doing everything in isolation. They just avoid human interaction, avoid relationships. So they're frozen in the sense they just aren't going to connect with anybody. Their flight is, I'm going to avoid problems, avoid life, avoid people, and just do everything alone. And so this is a person who can be all by themselves, work themselves to exhaustion, become even OCD-like in their behavior, and just panic if they have to go into any type of social interaction. But sometimes what happens to people in this scenario is they get so lonely, they crave a connection, but they're afraid of connection. And so they go to little short flings or into sexual fantasies to try to satisfy some of that loneliness and desire for connection. And that can cause all kinds of issues in their life. So those are the hybrids. Now let me take you to another angle that I hope will help you. Imagine if a person with any of these kind of 4 Fs and the 14 nuances of those Fs were to go to a psychiatrist to get diagnosed. What possible mental health diagnosis would come out of the blend of those 4 Fs and the 14 nuances of those? Well, think of a person whose main is fight. Well, they could be diagnosed as narcissistic personality disorder. They could be diagnosed as borderline personality disorder. They could be diagnosed as having anger disorders or conduct disorders or oppositional defiance disorder, ODD. All kinds of mental health disorders could come out of A person is basically just got a fight response that they've developed into their style. How about the flight? Well, you can get diagnosed with ADHD because you just can't get focused. Or OCD, you're just avoiding stuff by being distracted and preoccupied with your distractions and getting it just perfect. You can be diagnosed with anxiety disorder, depression, panic disorder, even DID. So that's all just a person with flight that got all kinds of mental health disorders that you could be diagnosed with. What about freeze? Well, they could be diagnosed with depression. They could be diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. They could be diagnosed with ADD, attention deficit disorder, ODD. Their freeze looks like they're defiant. How about Fawn? Well, I hope you can see that there's codependency for most people with Fawn. So Fawn people become codependent, but there's an anxiety disorder that's possibly there. So it's significant to me that a lot of people who've been given kind of mental health diagnosis, it's important to back away and go, you know what, maybe there's not necessarily anything wrong as far as chemicals in my brain. This is just how I've learned to cope over the years to survive. And these are just the 4Fs working themselves out in my life. And that's what I need to look at in order to get healthy. So let me take that to another perspective. Think then of a child and the 4 different childhood roles that we traditionally talk about. So we talk about the hero role, the comedian, the invisible child, and the scapegoat or the problem child. What's really going on there when you look at the 4 roles? Well, the hero, they're basically a child that is using mainly the fawn response to say, I need to please those in authority so I survive, so I don't get hurt, so I get my needs met, so I reduce the amount of anger in this house. So I need to take care of their emotions, and I need to know what they want and what they think about and what they feel. That's a hero child is an expert fawner. But sometimes a hero child can actually be a fight response. I'm fighting against some of the crap happening in this family by wanting to be a perfect child, be super responsible, to be super loving, to be super non-angry, so that hopefully I'll help this family become better. And so it's a child fighting to try to get a more healthy family. So that's just the child who's a hero, that it could be 2 different responses working itself out. Okay, what about the comedian? So what's a comedian? Well, I'm going to flight. I'm going to avoid problems. I'm not going to talk about what the elephant in the room, what's really going on. I'm just going to be funny. I'm not going to get serious. I'm not going to feel emotions. So there's flight, there's freeze, and there's fun. I'm going to make everybody happy and laugh. That will help this family. That will help me survive. That will maybe get my needs met. Then what's the invisible child? Well, I will be flight. I will go away. I will shut down, and I will not be a burden. That's my fawn response. I will be compliant. I would do whatever they want, but I'm going to hide out in my room. I'm never going to make demands. I'm not going to express emotions. So you got flight, freeze, and fawn in the invisible child, just in line with kind of what works for their personality. And then the problem child. That's the child who basically is fight or freeze. They're saying, I'm not going to put up with this crap. I'm going to fight back. I don't care if I get hurt, but I am not going to be dishonest about how screwed up this family it is, about how unjust, about the true nature of my authorities. Or it's a freeze response. I'm just going to dig in my heels. I don't know what else to do. I'm shutting down, and it comes across as super defiant. So a problem child can be a fight or a freeze response. So let me take it another perspective. How does all of these 4Fs affect a person's approach to relationships? So let's start with, how does it affect their approach to connection? So a fight person, they want connection, but they've got so much shame and so many fears that they try to get connection through control. So I will try to control your behavior, get you to do what I want. And as long as you submit to me, then we'll be able to connect. That's not really connection. It's pseudo connection because you have to submit totally to my control. And if you don't, then I'm going to go to fight and become angry. Flight. What are they doing to get connection? Well, never cause conflict, never rock the boat, don't aggravate the problem, avoid anything that's negative. So that way we can appear to have connection, but you can see again, that's not true connection because the other person has to put all their needs aside, can't stand up for themselves. So it's not true connection. Freeze. Connection is just not possible. Connection always results in getting hurt, so don't even go there. Just withdraw into isolation or a fantasy world. Fawn, let's have connection by acquiescence, by being a peacemaker, by being a people pleaser, by giving you what you want, by shrinking who I am, by putting my needs aside. So again, it appears like it's achieving connection, but none of these are achieving true connection. So every person is wanting connection, but they can't have it because they don't feel safe. They're in survival mode. So they're trying to create feelings of connection and what seems like connection, but it's not true connection. It's fake connection, pseudo connection. That is so important to understand, is that people using 4 unhealthy Fs will never achieve true connection. Let me take it a bit further. When you're in one of the 4 unhealthy F modes or their nuances, usually you're not going to be very good at being present truly. So be aware that if you're in the 4 unhealthy Fs, it gets in the way of being present. Okay, so that was the approach to connection. What about the approach to safety? So a fight person, they basically go, the way to be safe is to conquer the other person, to destroy them, attack them. And in their mind, okay, that resolved the problem, I'm safe again. It didn't really resolve it. The flight person, avoid conflict, please avoid problems, don't rock the boat, don't aggravate the problem. That seems to create safety. That seems to resolve the problem. But again, it didn't, because it didn't resolve the main issue. It avoided the issue. Freeze, safety through withdrawal. Safety, go into yourself, go into a fantasy world, get out of the problem. Then fawn, safety through acquiescence. So 2, 3, and 4, flight, freeze, and fawn, they appear like they're producing safety, but they're not. They're producing short-term physical safety, but they're not producing emotional safety, and they're not producing long-term safety because they're just sidestepping the problem temporarily. They're not dealing with or resolving the problem. So the problem just keeps coming back, and usually it gets worse and worse. So another way to say all of this is, if you are in the 4F mode, you're incapable of having a healthy relationship. It's hard to hear, but it's so important to hear. The 4 unhealthy Fs prevent healthy relationships. They prevent healthy connection. They don't provide true safety. So you can't be fully authentic, vulnerable, you can't truly connect, so you can't have a healthy relationship. Do you realize that if you were to take a personality test after kind of living in these 4 F's, unhealthy F's, and their 14 nuances for years, can you see how confusing a personality test might be for you? It'd be like, I don't know, because you've lived in these hybrids and nuances for so many years, it feels like that's who you are. And so that's why when we talked last time about personality, it's just for people coming out of complex trauma, it takes them a while to figure out who they really are. One other thing. It's so important to me for people to realize that the 4 F's have a progression. So they start out where you resort to the 4 F's in times of danger. But what happens in complex trauma is when you're in uncomfortable situations, uncomfortable emotions, almost all the time they lead to danger. They end up that you get hurt. You end up in more pain. And so now you don't use the 4 F's just in times of danger. You use the 4 F's every time you feel uncomfortable. And so now you're going to fight, flight, freeze, or fawn when you feel a little bit of anxiety, when you feel a little bit of sadness, a little bit of depression, when you feel anger. So they become your main way of coping with any uncomfortable emotion, not just with danger. That can set you up to making all kinds of bad decisions and not using tools to resolve problems that could easily be resolved, because now your 4 F's have progressed to just being used in uncomfortable emotions, not just danger. Let me end by just talking about how do we change this? What is the challenge to heal this? If you've been using these 4 F's and their 14 nuances for years. So basically what we're saying, and we've talked about this in much more detail, but just in summary, recovery is about beginning to face problems and deal with problems in healthy ways. That means I have to go back to the 4 healthy F's. So now when I face a problem, I am going to feel a strong pull towards going to the unhealthy F's and their nuances. And I have to resist those unhealthy F's and go, no, let's go to use the 4 healthy F's. Healthy fight, healthy flight, healthy fawning, healthy freeze. That becomes so important but difficult to do. And I think you can see that. And then secondly, in order to get to the 4 healthy F's, I have to regulate my emotions. I have to get out of my limbic brain back into my cortex and figure out what would be healthy tools to use. And then I have to use those healthy tools, have a plan of action. So that's the basic kind of steps that are involved in changing. To implement those is very complex, detailed, but that's the big picture of what we're doing. So that's a deep dive into looking at trauma responses and the many nuances of that and the many different layers of that. So I hope it helps you as you continue on your recovery journey and understanding your own trauma and healing from it. So that's the end of our Friday night. Thank you for being here.